Now that we have the blood composition tackled, we're going to move into the structural aspects of the cardiovascular system. So today we're going to start with looking at general circulatory pathways as well as blood vessel structure. You're going to have to understand the overall directional flow of blood as it moves through the system. That's also going to include the heart once we cover that next time. We will see blood move through the circuitry of the circulatory system in a very predictable unidirectional manner. Now, you won't have to know the names of the blood vessels that transports blood throughout the body, with the exception of the great vessels that enter and leave the heart. In lab, you will have to know the names of some of these vessels and identify them on models. But for here, we just need to know the directional flow. And we're going to look at the differences between blood vessel structure, not just artery versus vein, but even structural differences as we look within those two subcategories. So first, let's just look at general circulation. The circulatory system is going to be composed of a heart, a force generator, pressure generator, which will then move blood through a network of blood vessels. In the big scheme of things, we've got arteries, we've got veins, and we've got capillaries connecting the two. As a definition, arteries will always be the blood vessel that moves blood from the heart and takes it to the target tissues. It's going to pass through those target tissues, moving through a capillary. Once through the capillary, it's going to make its way back to the heart through the veins. Now, as we see arteries leave the heart and go towards the tissues, we're going to start at the largest of arteries. They're going to divide into smaller arteries. Those smaller arteries will divide into even smaller arteries. As we go from the heart to the tissues, we will see this directly decreasing size change as we move in that direction. Once we pass through the capillaries and start making our way back, the order is reversed. The smallest veins will be out into the tissues. And as those small veins converge together to form larger veins, and those larger veins converge together to form even larger veins again, we will see the venous side of our circulatory system increase in size as blood's coming back to the heart. And as mentioned, it's the great vessels that we're going to be paying most attention to as far as naming goes, and we'll be naming those once we look at heart anatomy. That's where they'll apply. The heart accomplishes unidirectional flow of blood. It's a muscular organ that acts as a pump. And to be a little bit more precise, it's two pumps, side by side in the same organ. We see muscular contractions closing down the volumes of chambers inside the heart, developing a pressure, and ejecting blood from the heart through the network of blood vessels that we had mentioned before. Because it can be looked at as a two-sided pump, we really have two different portions of our circulation. We will see one pump, the right side of the heart, pumps blood to the lungs. That blood passes from the lungs and back to the heart on the left side. The left side receives that blood, contracts again, and ejects that blood out to the rest of the body tissues. And when I say body tissues, again, one half pumps to the lungs, the other half pumps everywhere else. Head, arms, legs, abdominal organs, even to the heart tissue itself. So as the heart contracts and those chambers inside the heart get smaller, we generate a pressure. And from this point forward, we'll be referring to it as blood pressure. And it's going to be the force that will move blood through our network of vessels. In order for us to keep movement, we always have to have at least a minimal pressure. Now that unidirectional flow is going to be encouraged by valves that we have in the heart. So when the heart contracts and it generates force on that blood, it only has one way to go. Valves prevent it from backflowing. But we also see structures in the venous side that encourages one-way flow. We have to maintain minimal pressure. Pressure is generated at the heart, so it would make sense the further we get from the heart, the pressure in that blood is going to be lower. So in the veins, where we have a lower pressure scenario, we use valves to help minimize any backflow. And here's what both of our circuits are going to wind up looking like. We have the right side of our heart, we have the left side of our heart. Remember, we're going to look at these in anatomical position. The right side of the heart contracts, or the whole heart contracts, and any blood on the right side of the heart is going to be ejected to the lungs, left and right, out the pulmonary trunk, and go to our left and right pulmonary arteries. That's deoxygenated blood. Will pass through the lungs, come back through our pulmonary veins to the opposite side of the heart, the left side of the heart. That's going to be referred to as the pulmonary circuit. Blood that leaves the right side of the heart, goes to the lungs, and it comes back to the left side of the heart. That's the pulmonary circuit. Now that that blood has oxygen and it's over here on the left side, the next heart contraction moves that blood out through the network of vessels to all of the other tissues, depending on where it branches and takes the blood to. Blood leaving the left side of the heart moves blood out into what we call the systemic circuit. So it's almost like we have this figure 8 movement pattern where we start at the heart, we go to the lungs, we come back to the heart. Then we leave the heart, we go out to the body tissues, and then we come back to the heart again before getting ejected to the lungs one more time. Pulmonary circuit, pumping blood to the lungs. Systemic circuit, pumping blood everywhere else. When we look at the structure of an artery versus a vein, we'll see the same 3 layers. However, we're going to see differences in those layers when we compare artery to vein. The most internal layer is called the tunica intima. That's the part of the blood vessel that the blood comes in contact with. It's an epithelial lining called an endothelium. 1 cell layer thick, lining the inside of the blood vessel. Last time we talked about hemostasis, blood vessel damage. If we damage the tunica intima, we get those collagen fibers directly below it. So as long as we have an intact tunica intima, the platelets don't come in contact with the collagen. Von Willebrand factor doesn't have any collagen fibers to adhere to. So this lines the internal lining of our blood vessel, arteries and veins. Next up is tunica media. It's the middle layer. And this is going to be a muscular layer. We'll be talking about some blood vessels having the ability to constrict and dilate. That's going to be based on actions of the tunica media. Smooth muscle that when we contract that muscle, the blood vessel closes down and gets smaller. That's going to increase the pressure inside the vessel, but it's also going to increase the resistance of blood flowing through. And lastly, we have our tunica externa. That's the outside of the blood vessel. If you were doing a dissection and you cut open the abdomen and you pulled back some of the superficial tissue and you looked at it and you saw a blood vessel, looking at it from the outside, what you're looking at is the tunica externa. You'll see this also referred to as tunica adventitia in some textbooks. On the surface of a blood vessel, particularly the big ones, you'll even see smaller blood vessels running right along its surface, called a vasovassorum. It's the blood vessel of the blood vessel, because even the muscular layers here still have to be supplied with blood. So if we bring them up side by side, we start to see a little bit of that stark contrast. Same 3 layers in artery versus vein, but not all layers are created equally. Most notably, we're going to look at the tunica media and the tunica intima. The tunica media being the muscular layer. Arteries have a much more robust tunica media than veins do. Veins are rather thin. Arteries, it's going to be thick. So generally speaking, because this tunica media is involved with constriction and dilation, whenever you hear those terms, vasoconstriction, vasodilation, we're referring to the actions of an artery. The tunica intima of an artery is generally going to be very smooth, uninterrupted. Remember, this is on the high pressure side of our circulatory system. We don't want any obstacles in there impeding blood flow or causing turbulent blood flow. Nice, smooth tunica intima. However, in the veins, we will have a modified tunica intima that has valves associated. This is the low pressure side of our circulatory system. We're far away from the heart. We're coming back to the heart here. We move blood through the vein, and in order to encourage one directional flow with this low pressure side of the circulatory system, we have these valves that will prevent blood from moving in the opposite direction or pooling in the extremities. And of course, connecting the two is going to be a capillary. Blood leaves the heart through the arteries, keeps getting smaller, 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 ultimately winds up in the capillary, then heads to the venous system to return to the heart. Now, we've got subcategories of these blood vessels. It's not enough for us to go, well, this is an artery, this is a vein, because not all arteries are the same, not all veins are the same. Let's look at the veins first, because they're much more short and sweet. When we look at veins, we categorize them into three pretty logical categories. Large veins, small to medium-sized veins, and even smaller veins that we happen to call venules. Nothing fancy about that naming system. In the arteries, however, we've got the largest of arteries that we refer to structurally as elastic arteries. We've got arteries that are smaller that we refer to as muscular arteries. And then we have the smallest of arteries called the arterioles. Now, they have some nuances to their categorizations that we can kind of pick apart a little bit, make it a little bit more interesting. The largest arteries are called the elastic arteries. We tend to see more elastic fibers in the walls of that artery so that the artery can have a little bit more give and an ability to expand. That should make sense based on where we see the largest arteries. These will be the ones associated with the heart. The heart generates all this force. The first blood vessel that gets that blood, that high pressure blood, is going to be the large elastic arteries, like the aorta. You want that artery to be able to expand, stretch, because of the elastic fibers. But I want to point out something about the term elastic that seems to slip by some students. The term elastic doesn't mean to be able to stretch. Elastic fibers can stretch, but that is not the elastic quality of those fibers. When we talk about something stretching, the term for that is going to be the extensibility, not the elastic ability. Elastic fibers return to their original length. So if you take an elastic band, it's called an elastic band not because it can stretch, but when we let it go, it snaps back to its original size and shape. So if we use these large arteries to collect blood immediately as it leaves the heart, it absorbs that high pressure. And as it's being stretched, it's able to snap back and return to its original shape. Think about what that does to the pressure of the blood inside the heart. It somewhat acts as a little bit of a passive pseudo pump, because as that artery now is elastic and shrinking back in, it closes down the inside of that artery, generating more force. Valves prevent it from backflowing, and it propels blood even more efficiently along this portion of our vascular tree. Very muscular, but it's the elastic quality of it that we don't see elsewhere. Nor is it needed further from the heart. Pressure starts to drop. So this is really where the elastic nature is going to be most useful. Next up is the muscular arteries. Now, relatively speaking, if we were to measure the thickness of the tunica media in these arteries and compare it percentage-wise to the entire size of the blood vessel, the greatest percentage of this blood vessel is going to be muscular when compared to both the elastic and the arterioles. It has a greater proportional thickness of tunica media than the other types of arteries. But when we get to the arterioles, we give the arterioles a quality that seems to contradict what we said about the muscular. Arterioles have the greatest ability to constrict and dilate. So we said constriction and dilation was a product of that tunica media muscular layer. But we don't see great abilities to extend and contract in the muscular arteries. We see that in the arterioles. This is a much finer blood vessel. Just because we're talking about the tunica media here doesn't mean we can ignore the tunica externa and the tunica intima. Being a much more fine blood vessel, when the tunica media of the arterioles constrict, it doesn't have the rest of the bulk physically limiting how much it can constrict. So even though percentage-wise it has less muscle than the muscular artery, it makes better use of that musculature to get a wide range of motion, so to speak. We compare that in some sort of analogy to people as a whole. You might have someone who's extremely muscular, and you might have someone else that has less bulk to them, but pound for pound, they're stronger. They retain so much more range of motion. Someone may have stronger pecs, but as they bring their arm across the front, their own muscle may prevent the arm from coming across the chest. And it's the lack of bulk in the arterioles that makes it use its muscle a little bit more efficiently for constriction and dilation. And it's because of that ability to constrict and dilate to the extremes, we're going to consider arterioles to be the blood vessel that's mostly responsible for regulating blood pressure in the system. Next, we get to capillaries, the smallest of blood vessels. And as we saw when we looked at blood, only one red blood cell wide. Red blood cells had to squeeze themselves through a capillary. But this is going to be the part of the circulatory system where we have the ability to move things in and out. Nothing passes through the wall of an artery or vein. Once that blood gets to the capillary is when it has the ability to exchange gases with the tissues, send glucose out into the tissues, collect urea as a waste product, and bring it into the blood in order to take it to the kidney. A single layer of endothelial cells. So we don't even have our 3 layers. It's a single layer of cells. And they're not quite as simple as just one continuous tube. They're a little bit more sophisticated than that. We actually have a vascular bed, a capillary bed. And the first places I'm going to draw our attention to is that first branch off the arteriole. It's called a meta-arteriole. Still part of the overall capillary bed, but it's the immediate branch off the arteriole. Now, if we were to stay right on that course, as we get about halfway through, the name changes. Because the blood vessel that directly comes back into the venule is our thoroughfare channel. Think about this as one of those streets in town that you're driving along and it has a name, and all of a sudden, even without turning or anything, the name changes. That's kind of what happens here. At about midline, we stop referring to it as the meta-arterial and now as the thoroughfare channel. The true capillaries, that's its official term, the true capillaries, come off of this main connection point in somewhat of a horseshoe shape. There's where we get most of our exchange with the tissues. These arch-like true capillaries that extend off of the meta-arterial and our thoroughfare channel. So you should have an impression of general blood circulatory pathway. Blood goes from the heart, arteries, capillaries, veins, back to the heart. Systemic versus pulmonary circuits. When we get the heart done, you'll even add blood flow through the heart onto that model, knowing what chambers it runs through as it stays on one side of the heart. And then finally, you'll have to know blood vessel classification. And for these, we really won't be focusing on the veins. You'll hear me use the term venule quite a bit. But when it comes to knowing the nuances, muscular arteries, elastic arteries, and the arterioles, that's the ones I want you to be able to make the distinction between. So thank you very much. We're going to move from here, and next class we'll pick it up and look at the heart anatomy